The moment he laid eyes on this woman, a shot of desire fired somewhere so close to Calmer Ottosson that he could feel the concussion, and a whole tree of blackbirds rose at once into the sky. Which is the romantic way of saying that he just wanted to row her across Lake Michigan. Iris was wearing a black coat over a black dress and a hat with a veil that hadn't yet dropped over her face. He had seen her picture the day before in the Philadelphia Bulletin, but it hadn't prepared him for this. She was not beautiful so much as flawless. Everything perfectly in place, perfectly in balance, perfect calves, perfect ankles, perfect feet, although he couldn't actually see the feet, which were inside the shoes, setting off her ankles and calves. And the wings beat in his throat, all the panicked birds. On her arm was a second lieutenant named Jerome Jensen, to Calmer's knowledge the worst officer on his ship. A man of breathtaking incompetence, no attention span, in love with detail and procedure and the uniform itself, and who habitually wrote up enlisted men for the smallest infractions and informed confidentially on his fellow officers. It spoke to them both, perhaps, that Jensen had no whiff that he and Calmer were not eye to eye. On reflection, Calmer would see that in regard to what happened that morning vis-a-vis the widow Toebox. It was his own imagination at fault. He'd never imagined that even Jensen could make a botched job of greeting the congressman's widow. Calmer had intended to meet her himself, but after the loading accident wanted as much time to put the congressman and his box right as he could get, and so had turned it over to the first officer he saw, which was Jensen. It seemed like a good idea, in fact, as Jensen looked like an officer and always wore his uniform spotless and freshly pressed. Calmer was very clear with the orders. Greet Mrs. Toebox when she arrived at the ship, apologize for Calmer's absence, escort her to Calmer's quarters to await the burial, make her comfortable, offer her coffee or a drink, something to eat if she wanted it, the morning papers, and then leave her alone. He had given these orders slowly, patiently, and Jensen had nodded along just as patiently, yet here he stood, slightly behind her in the passageway, looking confident and not a little self-satisfied. "Commander Ottosson," he said, "may I present Mrs. Toebox? She has asked to be with her husband." She smiled and offered Calmer her hand. Pale, tapered fingers lay cool and light against his palm. Her wedding ring had been moved to her right hand, which he remembered was the custom of widows back in his part of South Dakota, too. He tried not to look at Jensen, afraid he might strangle him. "Allow me to offer you my quarters, Mrs. Toebox," he said, and now he did glance quickly at Jensen. "It's warmer, and there's something to drink. I'm sure you'll be more comfortable." "Thank you," she said, "but I prefer to be with my husband." She spoke directly and evenly, and her voice didn't begin to break as he thought it might. She waited a moment longer, then smiled politely and looked back at Jensen. "This way, you said?" "Yes, ma'am," and he nodded at Calmer as if he had everything under control. She started around him in the direction of the storage room. She was smooth and perfectly balanced, giving nothing away. Bereaved as a house cat from her outward appearance. He stood a moment watching her from behind, aching to protect her. Always his first impulse with women who attracted him. He realized this was not an ordinary impulse, not even faintly tangent to sexual intercourse, and there it was and had always been. Except this time there were birds, and the ache to protect her mingled with the woman's scent. He got to the door first. "I'm afraid there was a small accident bringing the casket on board," he said. She didn't seem to hear that, just waited for him to open the door. It was colder inside than he remembered. The casket also seemed different now, lying over the tables against the far wall, tied up like a hostage. Moisture had condensed on the lid. He sent Jensen to get Mrs. Toebox a chair, and for a few minutes he was alone with her in cold storage, and the panicked birds pounded in his throat. She seemed to think he had other things on his mind. "I'm quite comfortable here, Captain," she said. "I'm sure you have more important..."